Welcome to the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. Hope you're well and in good spirits and looking forward to summer's motoring, whether it's in your Aston Martin or not. Having said that, looking out the window today on a summer's day, it's looking very grim and miserable, but hopefully in the days and weeks to come it will get better. Now, before we get on to our main event, which is discussing mainly pre-war racing cars with Steve Waddingham and Ecurie Bertelli, I want to mention about a certain event that is coming up on Saturday the 12th of August. Unless you've been living under a rock for a few months, you can't help have missed our mailings and social media posts mentioning our third Aston Martin Heritage Festival to be held at the British Motor Museum at Gaydon. And as I said, that's going to be on Saturday the 12th of August. This will be a wonderful box set of three. We held our first one at Dallas Burson in 2021. The second at Brooklands Motor Museum last year. And as I said, this third one will be at the British Motor Museum on Saturday the 12th of August. This will be a wonderful box set of the three festivals, and this will be a good one as it will be celebrating and acknowledging a number of anniversaries, not least 25 years of the Aston Martin Heritage Trust. 25 years, can you believe how time has flown past on that one? And other anniversaries will be 60 years of the DB5, 20 years of the DB9, 75 years of the DB bloodline itself, and of course 110 years of Aston Martin Lagonda. Now, if you haven't already booked your tickets, I suggest you do so pretty soon. It's only a few weeks away at the time of recording. All you have to do is go to our spanking new website, amht.org.uk, and click on events and you'll find details of the festival there, and you can book your tickets through a link there to the British Motor Museum itself, and all you have to do is just fill in the form, what type of car you're bringing, what year and that sort of thing. The year helps us because if you're saying you're bringing a Vantage, well, what Vantage is that? Is that Gaydon Vantage or Newport Pagnell and so on. So it just helps us, and it also helps us in planning the display areas, because it won't just be a general car park. Certainly not that. The whole of the BMM site will be dedicated to Aston Martin, but we want to be able to park the cars by era, by themes, etc. So it really does help us tremendously if you could book your tickets as soon as possible, ideally by the 4th of August, a week beforehand. So we have some idea of how many DB5s, DB7s, DB6s, DB9s, Newport Pagnell V8s pre-wars, etc., are coming. And this just helps us plan the display. What we don't want is really 100 DB9s booking their tickets on the day before, Friday the 11th, and suddenly they turn up because we would have, shall we say, budgeted for a number of cars at that time. So although we're sure we would cope, we're a small and dynamic and a very able team. But the earlier you can book your tickets, it just makes everybody's life a lot easier. So, as I say, go to www.amht.org.uk, book your tickets. It's just £10 and it should be just a great day out. And also, don't forget, you will have full access to the Motor Museum itself. So it should be a great day with all these celebrations going on. Also, it's not just going to be a car park of Aston Martins. We have a number of presentations during the day. Delighted to have Steve Waddingham there, who is as you may know, is the Aston Martin Lagonda historian, the official historian, and delighted to say he has now joined us as a trustee. And he will be there throughout the day, doing a number of presentations, talking about the 60 years of the DB5, 20 years of the DB9 and the Gaydon facility as well. And also we'll be talking to various past Aston Martin employees and current ones as well, reminiscing about their time at Aston Martin. Also throughout the festival, we'll have a number of high-profile sponsors and traders there. So please do visit them and quiz them about your car, or you have an aspiration for an Aston Martin, or anyone want to talk about Aston Martin to any of them. I'm sure they'll be pleased to see you. So it'll be cars, traders, sponsors, presentations, and great friends as well, all on site. So I think it should be a guaranteed very good day out. So do please come along, and it must be well worth anyone's £10 if you can make it. But it doesn't just stop there, because we have a little event going on the Friday beforehand. the Friday evening before the festival. And this is the relaunch of the David Brown Memorial Lecture and Dinner. As some of you may know, we do have the Walter Hayes Memorial Lecture in January every year in London. And in the past, the Trust had held a number, shall we call, micro-lectures. These would be the David Brown and Dudley Coram at the time. And these were held around the country at various hotels and that sort of thing. And for reasons not quite sure why, they just seem to fizzle away. Now we're keen, because this is what the Trust is about. We want to share our archive, share the collection with you and others. So we want to relaunch these micro lectures. And the first one will be the David Brown Memorial Lecture and Dinner. And because we're talking about the 75 years of the DB bloodline, etc., this seemed an appropriate time. So on the Friday before the festival, Friday evening on the 11th of August, we'll be holding a dinner in the conference suite at the museum itself. During the evening, you'll arrive, there'll be canapes and drinks, soft and otherwise. You'll be able to mingle around the museum, have a look around at your leisure, and then later on in the evening, you'll be up for hopefully a delicious 3-course meal. Also during the evening, you will hear from Steve Waddingham, who will be talking about 75 years of David Brown, the David Brown bloodline. And I think that will be a lovely evening. So it'll be food, drink, and a presentation from one of the greatest historians on Aston Martin is available. So hopefully you can join us for that, as well as the festival. Now you can. How do you book tickets for this? Well, all you have to do is just drop an email to us at info@amht.org.uk. Drop us a line. We'll give you full details about the dinner the night before. As I say, this is in addition to the festival itself, so it does have to be booked separately. Now on to our main feature. You may recall from one of our earlier podcasts that we spoke about pre-war cars with, again, Steve Waddingham and Robert Blakemore being the Ecurie Bertelli Managing Director. At that time, we did 2 podcast recordings, and one of them went out. But back in the archive, we noticed there is still one there in the background, focusing on some of the racing cars. So what we did, we give it a digital polish and resurrected it for this podcast. So again, we're delighted to revisit Ecurie Bertelli, etc., and look back at the importance, some of the importance of pre-war racing cars, pre-war Aston Martins. So here it is. I hope you enjoy it. I'm Gary Taylor, and I'm here today at Ecurie Bertelli. And the reason I'm here is because, although I am a great Aston Martin enthusiast, I always thought that my knowledge of all Aston Martins from all eras was quite comprehensive. But in recent months, I have come to realise my pre-war knowledge is rather abysmal. So I hope to change that. And I hope to change that also with a very good friend of mine, Steve Waddingham, who's the Aston Martin Lagonda historian, and he is with me. And I understand, Steve, that although you champion yourself with great Aston Martin knowledge, you also felt that your pre-war was somewhat lacking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, for me personally, being with the company for about 30 years ago when I joined, like you say, I thought I knew a fair bit about Aston Martin and about history, but it was actually the turning point for me was the centenary. We had our centenary celebration in 2013, and probably like a lot of people, went to the big event in London and walked down the line of cars in Kensington Palace Gardens, and realised that halfway down the line I suddenly didn't recognise any of the cars. Well, I recognised some of them, but didn't really know what. I knew they were Aston Martins, yeah, but I didn't know what models they were. There was one particular car that absolutely blew me away because it's such an unusual car called the Headlam Coupe. Very pretty, beautiful Art Deco car, and it kind of made me feel determined to go back and find out about all these cars that the company that I work and love, work for and love being involved with, that had built these fascinating cars. I just didn't know what they were or anything about them, and I suddenly felt like a bit of bit of a fraud, really. Talking about Aston Martin history, but missing half of it. And so I thought,
and it's a very important part of it, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's obviously everything has to start somewhere, but the thing that's unusual about Aston Martin as a car maker is it's one of the few car makers that has a history that goes over 100 years, and it started off as Bamford and Martin Limited, which made a car called the Aston Martin, and then later that company, the initial company, folded, and then it became Aston Martin Motors after that, and ever since then Aston Martin has made Aston Martin cars. So all that rich history goes back a long way, almost double what some of our rival sports car makers have got. And I just felt that I wanted to know more about the cars, but also more about the company and the people who bought them and the people who worked for the company, because they're kind of like my ancestors as an employee, and I wanted to know how they lived and worked and what they were up against.
Is that history still available? Is that still there?
Well, I sort of, as I got into it, I did the usual thing and bought the usual books, and there's a handful of good books on the subject. But then I started to question what I was reading and talking to people, and finding out that some of what was written a long time ago and maybe wasn't as accurate as what things we now know. So I basically started to re-examine the whole thing and bit by bit piece the whole story together. Another big monumental part of my getting interested in this period was I went to meet with David Wright, who's an Aston Martin owner and a collector of all things Aston, and David invited me down to his house probably about 4 or 5 years ago now actually, and we had dinner and we sat and looked through his collection of very early documents and newspapers and things he's collected over the years, and photographs, and that evening I spent in there with David looking at all this stuff. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing, and there was so many questions coming out of it, and even things like where the actual sites in London were, because we're in London having dinner. And the funny thing was, it got to just after midnight, and I said, look, I better let you go to bed and I better drive home. And I got in the car and I thought, well, I'm going to be late home anyway, I may as well go and find Henneke Mews. I need to go and see where it all started. I'd never been there before. It was in the middle of the night, so I drove across London, following a sat-nav, found Henneke Mews, got out and had a look at Henneke Mews pretty much by street light. And then I thought, well, again, I'm going to be late home, I might as well go to Abington Road. So I went to the next factory site, which was Abington Road, which is where the Bamford and Martin premises were for the bulk of the cars that were built. And I stood at about 1:30 in the morning in the middle of this road in London with like mist and sort of fog creeping around the lampposts, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I thought, this is just incredible that these buildings survive, and I just need to go back and read up and find out more about it, and that really set me off on my kind of quest, really. So it started initially in 13, and then I suppose about sort of 2017 I really had this big kind of revelation this evening in London that sparked off my interest. And then through all the various people I've been talking to, including Robert and Andy from Ecurie Bertelli, I've managed to piece together big chunks of the story, really, and constantly reading into it and finding out more.
Are there any that particularly of your favourite, or you think that's not possible?
Yeah, it is almost impossible to pick one, and so I've had some of the best teachers, really, and including enthusiasts in the AMHT, and so I've had some great help from lots of interesting people, Neil Murray, Bruce and Jim Young, etc. But also coming here, which is not far from where I live, and meeting Andy and then Robert, and really Robert's probably the best person to answer the question, because he knows more about these cars than I do, and I'm constantly learning from Robert. So Robert, I think I'm going to pass that question to you, really.
Sure, yeah. Well, it is very difficult, I think, to come up with a car or even a few cars, because the history in this period is just so remarkable. It's so deep, there's so much of it, and it's generally pretty outstanding. So, I mean, to give you an example, downstairs in our workshop at the moment, we've got LM2, which is one of the two first cars to compete at Le Mans for Aston Martin. We've got LM7, which has got an outstanding race history. LM10, that is the only Aston Martin to finish 3 times consecutively at Le Mans. Red Dragon, which has got possibly the best race history of any Aston Martin ever built. And the Monoposto, which is a very late pre-war development car, which was doing some very remarkable things with the Cross Aero company and an engine that had rotary valves. So it's not really possible to distill it into such a small element. And the cars remained good and competitive after the war as well. So the what's known as the black car, that won the 1946 Belgian Grand Prix, and another car also driven by Jock Horsfall was raced at the Spa 24-hour race solo. So although Jock Horsfall had a co-driver nominated, he didn't use him, he just drove the whole lot on his own.
Right.
So you've got this that's the Bertelli era. We've also got the Bamford and Martin era with Count Zabrowski and the Grand Prix cars. So as you go through, there's just this hugely rich history of amazing characters, amazing results, very successful racing, and production of some truly outstanding cars, not just race cars.
Because they were, I understand, Aston Martin were in the early days, really were just making racing cars. They very rarely made any cars for production. That was the case, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, 1913 was Bamford and Martin was founded, as we know. They built they built a car the following year, which became the Coal Scuttle, nicknamed the Coal Scuttle. A year after that, they named it an Aston Martin and registered it as an Aston Martin. But they didn't actually sell a car to the public until 1923. So the first 2 cars to be sold were TT1, TT2, the Grand Prix cars, which were rebuilt and then sold as not brand new, but they were sold as cars to the public. And then the very first customer car was delivered shortly afterwards. But that was 10 years after the company originally founded as Bamford Martin started. 10 years to go from start-up to making a car and selling it, really.
And that continued after Bamford and Martin with Bertelli. So all the cars have underpinnings of race cars. So they although they produce long chassis variants and they produce saloons and various other bodies, the underpinnings, all of the running gear, all of the chassis, all of the engines fundamentally are race derived.
What do you feel could be pinned down, could be pointed as being the first Aston Martin racing car? Is there one that could say the earliest one that had a success? Is there one that?
Well, Coal Scuttle did the first ever competition, which was in 1919 when it was entered in the London to Edinburgh, and it got a gold medal. So that was a road trial, basically.
Road trial, yes.
Obviously, there was a hill climbing that Lionel Martin did before, which led to the name Aston Martin. And but the first actual motor race on a circuit, I believe, was 1920, and that was a car called Bunny.
Bunny, yes.
Bunny had grown from another car called the Prototype. So we had A1, if you like, is the number that we use for Coal Scuttle, and then B2, which was known as the Prototype, and it snapped in half. So they built another chassis for the Prototype, and from the remains of the broken car, they made a car called Bunny. And then Bunny really became the kind of track car that seemed to do most of the sort of hard racing work after that point. And I believe it was that car that raced in 1920. So that was our first actually going round in a circle, if you like, on a circle.
Right.
At Brooklands.
So that's away from the road trials and hill climbs.
And I think 1921, from memory, was our first race win at Brooklands.
When obviously Aston Martin has a great history in Le Mans. When was their first attack on Le Mans?
That was 1928, LM1 and LM2.
Right.
So the LM cars, so that LM is the chassis number, LM1, LM2, up to, well, certainly LM21, possibly LM22 and 23, depending on how you categorise those cars. And it's thought that LM stood for Le Mans. There's no, as far as I'm aware, no definitive proof that that's the case. So, yeah, 1928 was the first attempt.
And do these cars still exist?
Well, LM2's downstairs at the moment.
Right.
It's still very active. Last year it drove from Belfast all the way down to Mantova, about 1,500 miles. It then competed in a 1,000-kilometre rally called the Nuvolari, drove all the way back here to our workshop. We had it for a week, prepped it, and then it was in the Horsefall race at Silverstone, and it was on pole, and then eventually came second overall, just behind a 4.5 litre Bentley. So not only is it still around, it's still very active and being used properly.
And no part of that journey was on a trailer?
No part on the trailer, and in fact we drove it to and from Silverstone to race, which is exactly what they would have done in period. There were no race transporters. They were driven everywhere. So they would, if you were doing the Mille Miglia, it would be a 1,000-mile drive to the start, 1,000-mile race and 1,000-mile back. So these cars are not fragile in any way. They're not slow, and they are remarkable cars. So and they're still doing it. And why not? Fabulous.
You took me out earlier in the LM7.
Yes.
Can you tell me the history of that LM7?
Yeah, well, LM7, again, was a works car. So it was first out in 1931, and it competed at Brooklands in something called the Double 12. So in the UK, we were not allowed to race for 24 hours straight. So the 24-hour racing was split into 2 12 hours with a parc fermé situation in between. So it raced there. Unfortunately, it retired, and it was back at out racing at the Ulster TT, which was a very important race. It was the only road racing you could do in the UK. And then it did the London to Exeter trial, and then 1932 back out again with 5 or 6 Brooklands events. 1933 off to Le Mans again, unfortunately retired once more, and then a good number more Brooklands events, so very well raced in period. The factory sold it, but straight after the war, Inman Hunter bought the car, and he reunited it with a little plaque which had the pit signals for Le Mans. He owned it. He restored it between 19...
So those pit signals and,
Yes.
and traffic light things, they were from that era?
Yeah, absolutely.
And they found those and they put those back on there. So they
Indeed.
date from 1930...
It'll be probably 1931.
1931,
back.
so original...
Well, it's interesting you say about pits as well, because the other thing about the whole motor racing, we all know that when cars are racing, they pull into an area off the circuit for maintenance, fuel, whatever, and it's called the pits. But Aston Martin, as a team, again when it was Bamford and Martin, they decided to have a go at some world records in 1922. So with Bunny. And they realised that in order to try and get the best result they could, they needed to get organised so that when the car came in, for them to put the fuel in, do the permitted things they could do within the record attempt, that they needed to get themselves organised so that when the car pulled up, they weren't all getting in each other's way. So Lionel Martin and the guys involved used to go at night time back to the workshop at Abington Road, and they used to practice the drill. They used to call it drill, so the pit drill, and they used to push the car in to a white line on the floor of the workshop, and they'd all go around each person would grab a wheel, and Lionel Martin would be stood with a stopwatch, and they did this over and over again until they got it down to a fine art.
So even then they practiced the pit stops?
Yeah, so we prided ourselves on being organised, and it was those extra seconds that they sliced off doing that helped achieve all the records that they broke.
So a standard
1922.
F1 pit stop these days is 2 seconds, 2.5.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it?
Nowhere near that.
But the interesting thing is that the guys that were working with us at the time, some of these sort of big names around the Aston Martin story, like SCH Davis is a good example, Clive Gallup. These guys later on, after Aston Martin or Bamford and Martin had folded up, so the original company, they went off to work for W.O. Bentley, and they became the Bentley boys, and they took with them what they'd learned with Lionel Martin and what they'd practiced and what they'd used, and they used that at Le Mans, and that's partly why Bentley had all the success it had at Le Mans, was again down to the fact that they were very organised in the pits, and that helped get the cars back out on the track. And so you could say that, and Bentley can owe us one for this one, that we helped Bentley get its reputation for winning at Le Mans, because it was our guys that became the Bentley boys and took with them their experience from racing with Lionel Martin and used it to such good effect that it would win Le Mans multiple times.
Well, it'd be fascinating to get someone from Bentley on here and see what they say against that. They may have a
Don't mention the James Bond film and the book. But yeah, it's just part of the story, isn't it? And these characters that were involved, they were individuals that were pitching in to do the best they could. And with this tiny little fledgling brand, if you want to use the modern word, that Aston Martin was in the 1920s, and then it was built upon in the 30s with Bertelli, and then later the Sutherlands.
Do you know, it is great that we are hearing and seeing these cars still being used. I think it is amazing, because they are valuable.
Yes.
They are reassuringly priced, expensive if you like, but they are still being used in the spirit that they were built for.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the value of them comes really in their rarity, their history, and their usability, but that's not really reflected in the cost of looking after them. So, worst cases, if you did have a crash, then it doesn't cost any more to repair that on a car with amazing history and a big price tag to one which is far cheaper to buy.
So these cars are 80, 90 years old. Parts and rebuilds, how do you cope with that these days?
Well, Aston Martin certainly in the beginning made virtually every component themselves, and as you trace the pre-war history through, you can see they slowly bought in more assemblies. But having said that, the last car they built, the 1598, had back axle, gearbox and brakes and a few other bits bought in, but the rest was still Aston Martin. And it's a double-edged sword, really. It's great because they're so beautifully built, but it does mean I can't go anywhere and buy some parts. So we make them. So we make, at the moment, just under 2,000 individual components.
And that goes back to the nuts and bolts themselves, aren't they?
Indeed. So not every nut and bolt, but there are some sort of off-the-shelf nuts.
Yes.
But there are some nuts which are not off-the-shelf, and we make specific nuts and bolts and springs and all sorts of things. And we go as far as making complete engines, brand new gearboxes. Even things like the speed models had a magnesium alloy for most of their castings, and we replicate that now. So.
And when I had a brief tour, I think I saw the future, 3D printing.
Yeah, so we do a little bit of 3D printing. Some of our cylinder heads they're not 3D printed, but the sand into which they're cast is 3D printed. And it's a new technique, certainly for us. It's really born out of accuracy, so scanning an original part and using this technique is very accurate. My feeling is we've got to be very careful. I don't want to go down a super high-tech route because that's not true to the cars. So we still have a lot of handcraft, or the majority is handcrafting skills. However, when these technologies are available and they are useful and the finished product is true to the original and very high quality, it seems silly not to use what's available to make the same part but more efficiently.
It's amazing, and I think it's great that there's companies like Ecurie Bertelli keeping this heritage alive, keeping these cars going. With that in mind, Aston Martin, they enjoy their heritage. they use it. Steve, how do you feel that some of this pre-1940, pre-war cars, how does that fit in with Aston Martin today?
Well, we've always looked forward as a company, but we've always also, acknowledged the past, and sometimes we reference certain things from the past. I mean, even the logo of the company, the wing logo, has consistently sort of developed over the years, and it's just had another makeover very recently for the launch of the F1 team, and that itself, that design of the logo, goes back to the Art Deco period, really, 1932. So yeah, the one thing I think about Aston is that we still make the same type of cars that we did in the beginning. We make sports cars, and our cars were never the lightest cars. They were always well built, and they were comfortable, even the early cars. So I think we're one of the few car makers that still does what it did in the beginning. We don't make shopping.
That's an interesting point.
We don't really make shopping cars as such. I mean, you can go shopping in any of our cars, but the cars are what they are. They're sports cars, and even the DBX, it's a sports utility vehicle. That's what SUV stands for. And it, as you know from all the accolades it's got, it drives like a sports car, but it just happens to be an SUV. So yeah, that's for me. This one of the biggest lessons is the fact that we don't lose sight of what we were trying to do in the beginning, really. And the cars are built in small numbers. They're all still individual, and that really is guided by the origins of the company, in my opinion. And we're all very, very mindful of that when we make decisions about the new cars as things develop, really.
Robert, looking to the future, how do you see the future of continuing racing these cars? I'm thinking of regulations, environmental studies, E10 fuels coming in. These cars will be able to adapt and move on to that new environment?
I think so. As long as we can get a liquid fuel, then we'll be able to run the cars. So E10 is not a problem for us. We may well have to change fuel hoses and a few seals, but fundamentally the cars will be fine running on E10. There is also some quite exciting, certainly for me, developments around synthetic fuels, and I think that will be something that I would very much welcome. I think that's a very sensible thing to be doing. And if there is a stopgap period, then I think there are two things to consider. One is the very low numbers of these cars. So even if we were to continue to run on a fossil fuel based product, then the impact that has on the environment is, with 450 cars globally, not going to really be noticeable. But then sometimes these run on things like methanol and other completely bio-derived fuels. So I don't see it being a problem at all.
Gentlemen, it's been fascinating. We could spend a whole 1 or 2 or 3 podcasts on this subject. I'd like to come back again at another time to talk about various eras and various models. But in the meantime, that's it for this podcast. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope to see you at the festival on the 12th of August, or even at the dinner on the 11th of August. Thank you very much for listening. And if you do enjoy these podcasts, it really does help if you can rate these on your podcast provider, wherever you do get these, and follow. It really just help us get up the rankings. So if you can rate it, this podcast or any of the previous ones, that will be very helpful. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your time, and hope to see you again soon.
You're listening to the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. Discover more about the story of Aston Martin, the cars, the people, the history with the Aston Martin Heritage Trust. You're always welcome to visit us at our museum in Oxfordshire, so find out more via amht.org.uk.